Good morning, everyone. If you would open up your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and in verse 1, that's where we'll start off. Just want to welcome our visitors. We're thrilled that you're with us this morning, and hope that we can maybe get a chance to talk to you a little bit in the back afterwards. I think it would probably be best if we just start off by reading 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 10. Again, that's going to be the main text of discussion this morning. It's here that Paul writes, "For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. And so we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." Pretty sure I've shared this story before, but I'm banking on you guys all forgetting it. I think just my first experience with death was a funeral. I don't remember who it was, but it must have been open casket or something, because there was something just kind of awakened in me. Something clicked at this funeral where all of a sudden death became a real thing. You know, when you're younger and you're growing up, maybe you first hear that word and you understand that, you know, maybe somebody in your life, a grandparent or something, they cease to exist. But at some point in life, as you mature, at some point something clicks. And death isn't just something that you read about in books. It's not just something that happens to bad guys in the movies that we watch, but death is something that happens to us all. And we realize, and it dawns on us, that it is something that eventually will happen to me. It is something that eventually will happen to all of our loved ones, that is, unless Jesus comes back before that happens, and let's hope that he does. But I remember driving home in the car that evening, because the funeral was in the evening and the sun had already set, and there was just something that about driving home in the darkness after a funeral that just kind of exaggerated that dark feeling that comes with death. And I think sometimes we try to look at death lightly, or if not, we try to ignore it altogether. But I think that when we are initially afraid of death, when we have this feeling of darkness as we contemplate death, there is something, at least initially, as somebody that is outside of Christ, as I was at that point in my life, there's something that's healthy about that. Because we read the Bible and we understand that God didn't make the world with death in it. He didn't create us to live and then die. He created us to eventually live with him forever, and that's what Adam and Eve were enjoying in the garden. And so when we feel this great tragedy of death, maybe people in our own life pass away, or maybe we are facing it ourselves, there's something that is relatively healthy about that, as in our hearts we understand this isn't how it's supposed to be. But I think that we can get a bit excessive, where death becomes something that we are just extremely afraid of. And that fear begins to kind of control our lives, and we convince ourselves, some people in the world try to convince themselves that they're going to find a way around it. This is a man named Brian Johnson. He's kind of a most recent example of somebody trying to avoid death. Those pictures on the left and on the right, they're the same pictures, not the same pictures, same person. And, he's totally not creepy in that picture on the right. But he is a tech billionaire. I think he sold his tech company, I forget what it was, for about $800 million at the time. And he has basically dedicated his life to trying to find, figuratively speaking, the fountain of youth. And he now, at this point in time, he takes, I read, 111 pills every single day. He hooks himself up to equipment constantly to monitor the progress that he's making in his organs. He even sleeps with something hooked up to himself so that he can see how his body is performing as he seeks to have the organs and the body of an 18-year-old. He's now 46. And he spends, what I read, about $2 million a year trying to prolong his life. This is somebody that is obsessed with death from the standpoint that they are afraid of it. That they're trying to find any way possible to squeeze just a little bit more out of this life. And no doubt the ideal would be for him to be in this body and to live forever if he can find a way, if he could spend enough money to make it happen. And I came across one quote that I think describes this mindset very well, because you look at all the things he's giving up, you look at all the things he's doing and putting his mind and body through, and you ask yourself, is he really living this life? The days that he knows he has, the day today that he has, is he really living this life to the fullest? I think that when you read about his life, I would say not necessarily. What good is life if you're constantly worrying about death and trying to avoid it? And so one person said, there are some who feel 1,000 deaths in fearing one. Let me read that again. There are some who feel 1,000 deaths in fearing one. When you boil it down, this is what makes the point particularly important. Because if we fear anything other than God, but especially if we fear death more than we fear God himself, it's always going to be and lead to a haphazard way of life. We are always going to be falling short of our potential. We are always going to be falling short of the duty and tasks that God has set before us if we allow this fear to control us. And so that's why I want to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, because I think Paul, he is describing to the Corinthians, as apparently he's being accused behind his back, that all these things he's suffering are a bad thing. These super apostles, that's a whole other story in and of itself, that are demeaning Paul and the persecutions and the suffering that he has gone through in his life. And Paul is showing, no, there's a reason why I'm willing to suffer these things. It's because of my faith in God. There's a reason why I'm willing to put my life on the line. It's because of what I believe through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so I think that when you look at this passage, which is part of a larger discussion in 2 Corinthians, you begin to get insight as to why exactly it is that Paul had so much courage and was willing to suffer to the extent that he was willing to suffer. And so that's why I've titled this sermon, Facing Death with Faith, because that is what you see, I think, in this text, and particularly in the life of Paul in this text as well. And so one of the things I want you to notice in those first 5 verses is Paul is bringing out the idea that we are prepared for death. We are prepared for death because there is something prepared for us on the other side of death. And so he starts off in verse 1 by saying, we know. He says, for we know. And Paul's not just talking about some specific insight that he himself has or some secret that he knows that no other Christian knows. He includes his entire audience in this proclamation. He says, we all know that if the tent, that is our earthly home, is destroyed, he's talking about the body as this tent. He says, if our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the dwellings. If you read the article, then you already know where I'm going with this, but there is this body of water, this channel of water that lies right in between Europe and Africa. And it's known as the Strait of Gibraltar, and that's, it depicted right there. And this is a very important strait as it connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean, which eventually will lead you, if you stay in the Atlantic Ocean and head in a straight line, you'll eventually get to, North and South America. For the longest time, when you would come and sail through this area of the world, and you'd be going through the strait, and that's a 3D reconstruction of that picture, you notice how there's kind of these two cliff sides, these two peaks on either side. And it's said that what they would inscribe on these cliff sides was the Latin phrase ne plus ultra. And what that means, a lot of times it's used today to describe something that is impossible to improve upon. It's often used today to describe something that is perfect, but what it literally means, if you translate that word, is it means no more beyond. And that's really how this site became known throughout the centuries. It was known as the place where there is nothing more beyond. And so you had people that would scrawl on their maps, no more beyond. And apparently Spain controlled this part of the world at a time, and they had coins that depicted these two peaks as pillars. They called them the Pillars of Hercules. And in between those two pillars on the coin was scrawled the phrase, ne plus ultra. That this is the point of no beyond, or no more beyond. And what this was, it wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning to the people that were sailing through this portion of the world, that as they approached it, they were warned as they saw those words that there is nothing left beyond this point. Because that's what much of the world believed at the time. That's what the known world believed at the time, is that once you get to the Strait of Gibraltar, the world is flat or something, and the ocean, if you keep going in that direction, you're eventually just going to fall off the face of the earth, because there is absolutely nothing out there. That is until 1492, something happened, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And he was willing to go beyond those 2 points. He was willing to go to the area of the world where people said there's absolutely nothing out there and you're wasting your time. And he discovered that exactly the opposite was true. That there were these two continents that were teeming with life and beauty. There was people already that were settling over there. And he discovers this when people said, no, there's nothing left. You know, what's interesting to me as I contemplate on the statements and the assertions that man will make about what lies beyond death. How confident some people are to say ne plus ultra when staring death in the face, that there is nothing else beyond this life. And I look at just the world history, and we've said that about the planet, the physical planet that we are on, and they have made those confident assertions, and yet even of this planet, they were wrong. That there was more beyond. And they made these assertions, and what these assertions were is they were just assumptions. And so you can go online today and you can find these coins rather than saying ne plus ultra. This is I think it's a peso, and it says not ne plus ultra, but it says plus ultra. They dropped the ne. And they realized that this was the point in the world. It wasn't the last stop, but they realized that there is more beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. And so Paul, I just think of this, and Paul says and reflects on the gospel, and he says, we know. He makes this confident assertion, but it's not based off an assumption. He knows this because Jesus, similarly to Christopher Columbus, he set the maiden voyage to the unknown world through the cross, and he came back from it with news of a new world. A world where there is also, a world that is also teeming with life of heavenly hosts, where God himself dwells, that we now have access to through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so this was something that Paul was just firmly convinced of, that we are prepared to die because Jesus has come back and he has given us good news that there is more beyond this thing that we call death. There's more beyond this life. And so he says simply that if this tent, that is our earthly home, is destroyed, we have a building from God. So Paul is comparing his body simply to a tent. And that's very interesting to me that he compares his body to a tent. Why a tent? It's because a tent is temporary. You know, Paul himself, he worked on tents. He made tents for a living for a time. And so as he's working on these things, I just imagine him working on it and envisioning himself saying, you know, this tent that I'm working on, it's a lot like my body. That it'll do for a time, it'll keep you out of the elements to some extent, but that tent eventually, over time, will wear out. And we all like camping, but there's a limit to how much we like camping, isn't there? It's funny, I guess Kent, Olivia, and Ava, they camped 2 nights in a row in their yard there, and Kent was unwilling to make it a 3rd night. And there's something that's particularly difficult about camping when your own house that is on foundations that has heating and air and a refrigerator stocked with food and warm showers. There's something that's particularly difficult about living in a tent when you know that there's a house just, 20, 25 feet away from where your tent is. This is how Paul envisioned life in this body. That this tent, this body, it wasn't meant as it is because of sin. It's not capable of living forever. This body that we have, all it is a temporary dwelling place that is not capable of lasting to eternity. And meanwhile, to contrast that, he says, that's okay. Once we shed this tent, he says, we have a building. He says the difference between this life and the next, the difference between this body and the heavenly bodies that we will once, sometime enjoy at the resurrection, he says the difference is between an earthly tent, something without foundation, something that is made out of fabric, something that is not able to withstand heavy rains. He says the difference between this life and the next is the difference between a tent and a building that is built on foundations. It's permanent. It's sure, it's certain, it's something that you would rather live in if given the 2 options right in front of you. And the main distinction between these 2 things is that Paul goes on to say that this is eternal in verse 1. It's eternal in the heavens. It's so sad because that is exactly what people are seeking. Paul is talking about bodies here. He's talking about an earthly body and a heavenly body. What is it that man, Brian Johnson himself, was seeking? He is seeking a body that will last forever. And what is it that Paul is saying we know is going to happen, that we know we're going to enjoy in this next life? A body that'll last forever. And yet, how many people, they miss that because they're spending their time in vain trying to take a tent and make that tent into a permanent dwelling. It'll never work because the only permanent dwelling that we are able to attain is the one that God gives us in Jesus Christ. And so for now, it's interesting as Paul describes this tent. He says, in this tent we groan. We long to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may be found naked. For while we are still in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed. You notice that Paul uses the word we groan twice. And I don't need to describe to you all what that means. You all know what that means. That as we live in these bodies, it's uncomfortable. We groan because our bodies age and we begin to experience more and more aches and pains. And not only that, we might endure and encounter temptation, but there's going to come a time where we exit this life, we exit this body, and we enter a new body that is free from all these things that make us groan, that make us feel burdened, that weigh us down. And so Paul, he looks at the life to come and he looks at it with confidence, knowing that we are prepared for something better. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 5, he says, "He who has prepared us for this very thing is God." That man, he paid $2 million a year trying to live longer. And no doubt that money is being paid to people that are much smarter than him. But we have eternal bodies, and they've already been paid in full with the invaluable blood of Christ. We have a longevity plan that will last an eternity, that we can be confident of how sure and how good it is going to be. And so at the end of the day, Paul pictures death as moving from a tent simply to moving to a house. That word he uses in verse 1 when he talks about our tents being destroyed, that might be too strong of a translation. What that means simply is to strike down. And I think Paul envisions that there's going to come a time where with death you kind of take your tent down, you fold it up, and you move on to that permanent dwelling. This is how Paul imagined death. And so notice this, that death in his mind, it's not some disaster. For a Christian, it's not a tragedy to be dreaded, but rather it is a passage to an eternal weight of glory. It's precisely this view that Paul had about death that allowed him to say on a couple occasions in this passage, for example, he says it in verse 6, he says, "We are always of good courage." Another version might say, "We are always confident." And the reason he's confident is because he viewed death simply as being this homecoming. That while we are here on this earth, he pictures us as being away from the place that we truly belong. He says we're always of good courage. We know that while we're at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we're of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. The words Paul uses here are interesting. He uses two Greek words to describe being away and to describe being home. The first one he uses for away is ekdemio, which means to be abroad or to be away from home. And the second word he uses for home is endemio. You notice how similar those sound. That we're ekdemio and we're endemio. But that word endemio, it means to be in a familiar place or to be home. That as Paul imagined us in this life, in this body, he imagines us as being abroad, as living in exile. That we are in this body, and while we made it comfortable in this life, and there's a certain degree of familiarity to it, he says, in reality, we are away from home. We are away from that familiar place, that place where God is dwelling. You know, one of my favorite songs is the song, "This World Is Not My Home." You know, I'm just a passing through. That's one of my favorite songs. I've loved that song since I was a kid. But I think deep down, we understand that none of us belong in this world. We understand that this world we live in, it's just, we're occupying it for a temporary amount of time. And I think when you really boil it down, that's the amount of time that we want to spend here. We don't want to be in this world forever. And the reason I know that is because we're all complaining about the world. We look around at the world, and how many of us take issue with the world as it currently stands? How many of us find and identify things going on in the world that we say, man, how much longer am I going to have to put up with this? You know, how much longer am I going to have to deal with dishonest people? Or how much longer am I going to have to watch my loved ones and friends die? Or how much longer are we going to have to deal with corruption in high places? And there are all these things that we look at and we complain about them. And the reason we complain about them is because deep down we know this is not the life we were designed for. This is not the way that the world was meant to be. I was listening to Bill Maher, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Bill Maher. He's an atheist. And he was interviewing another man named Stephen A. Smith, and they were talking about death. And this man he was interviewing, a sports broadcaster, he was talking about how he doesn't fear death, but it wasn't because of his beliefs in God. He didn't talk anything about that. He says the reason he doesn't fear death is because of how messed up this world is. That he looks around at how things are going, and he says, I don't like it. It frustrates me, it makes me angry, and so he has just fully embraced death in his mind because he just can't wait to be removed from everything that he sees, and it had nothing to do with his faith. But what that's showing is that in his heart, he looks at things and he understands that this isn't how it's supposed to be. Now, Paul, similarly, he looks forward to death, but not because of how messed up the world is, although that might be part of it. But really what he was more focused on was how much better the life to come is going to be. You notice specifically Paul says that in verse 4, he says, while we're still in this tent, we groan being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. You see, Paul, even with all that he went through, he wasn't a man that lost his joy. He still, I look at him as somebody that enjoyed his work, was fulfilled in the things that he was doing for God. He didn't have some fatalist outlook on life where he's just, man, you know, he has a death wish or something like that. That's not how he's thinking of death, but he thinks of death not as being unclothed, not as exiting this world, but as moving on to something better. That's what gave him his hopeful outlook in life, even while he was going through all the things that he was going through. And he realizes as well that we're just made for so much greater desires, that God has designed us for such a greater purpose than what we are capable of experiencing in this life. In chapter 4 and verse 17, I want you to notice that he says, well, we'll back up to verse 16 of chapter 4. He says, so we don't lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are seen are eternal. You know, that last point, I mean, he tells us, first of all, that it's not, what we're going through in this life isn't going to compare to what we have in the next. But he reminds us that the things we're seeing, they're temporary. They're transient. And he compares that to the things that are unseen. He says those things are eternal. That everything that we experience in this world, whether it's good or bad, it is temporary to a certain degree, isn't it? That every temptation we give into, that's only going to satisfy us temporarily. But even the good times that we enjoy with family members, those good times are temporary, so we better not get too comfortable. He says we look not to the things that are seen, but we look to the things that are unseen. And he's looking towards heaven. He's looking towards his home. C.S. Lewis had this to say. He says it better than I could. He says, indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea, we are far too easily pleased. I would add to that, we are far too easily discouraged, knowing that there is something so much better promised for us in the future. So again, Paul says this light, momentary affliction. Imagine a man going through all that he went through saying that. He says, a light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. You know, somebody like Paul, he couldn't have done the things that he did if he was walking by sight. Earlier in chapter 4, he has this statement where he's talking about generally the things that he had been through. And he mentions that, he's been afflicted in every way in verse 8. He says we're perplexed. He says we are persecuted. We are struck down. You know, if he was just walking by sight, that's all that Paul would have seen is reasons to give up, reasons to stop going, reasons to believe that God has abandoned you. But he says we walk by faith, not by sight. And so rather than just saying those things, Paul says, yes, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. You know, if Jesus lived only by sight, he would have only seen the cross and the crowds and the people that abandoned him. But he knew that there was an eternity of joy that led before him, and therefore he despised the shame and endured the cross. And so, again, to emphasize, this is why Paul says, again, we are of good courage, where we always have confidence. He says we'd rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. You see, Paul doesn't look at death and the eternal reward is some sort of consolation prize for having gotten through this life. But he looks at death and he says, you know what? I would rather be there. I'd rather be with God. And I want you to see how he describes being with God. He says, we'd rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. You know, I don't know about you, but I think sometimes deep down in my heart, I think about heaven and I imagine it being a strange place. I imagine it being a place that I would never really fit in. I imagine it being a place that feels very unfamiliar, where for an eternity I'm going to feel like a square peg trying to go through a round hole. I want you to see that's not how Paul imagined eternity. As the holidays are coming up, I sometimes sit around with family around the dinner table at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, and it's tempting to kind of think, even if it's subconscious, on a subconscious level, it's tempting to think, this is the most familiar that I'm ever going to feel. This is the most at home that I'm ever going to feel. This is the greatest sense of belonging that I'm ever going to experience. And we convince ourselves if we could just pause these moments. But that's not how Paul thought of things. Yes, we are able to experience familiarity and that sense of belonging, and that's part of why the church is here. But Paul looked forward to life with the Lord, and I want you to see how he describes it. He doesn't describe it as being strange or weird. He describes it as being home. That whatever sense of belonging and familiarity you experience in this life, how much more are we going to experience that when we are in the very presence of God? He describes it as this great homecoming. And so again, Paul says, and he's confident, he says, I would prefer to be with the Lord. I just want to ask, do we have that attitude? Do we really have this attitude? Do I have this attitude where I genuinely would prefer to be with the Lord? Not in the sense that I have some death wish, but in the sense that I'm at peace with moving on to the next life, knowing that there's actually something better for me there than there is here. I ask that because I'm afraid, even in myself at times, as Christians, that that's not the outlook that we have. That death, rather, is something we slavishly fear. And what's sad about that is that the very work of Christ is meant to free us from being slaves to the fear of death. I like what Spurgeon said. This is a continuation of a quote I mentioned earlier. He said, "There's some who feel 1,000 deaths in fearing one. Doubtless the shadow of anticipated trouble is, to timorous minds, a more prolific source of sorrow than the trouble itself. But faith puts a strengthening plaster to the back of courage and throws out the window the dregs of the cup of trembling." In the letter written to the Hebrews, in Hebrews 2 and verse 14 through 15, it says, "Since therefore the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise," talking about Jesus, "partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." The point that's being made there is that Jesus delivers us from having this slavish fear of death so we can be free in serving him at whatever costs, knowing that the worst that can happen is somebody can strike down this tent of mine and I move on to an eternal dwelling, a building designed by God himself, not made with human hands, but made by God himself. Lastly, I want you to see that Paul seems to bring out that we also have someone that we are to fear in a greater degree. He can't finish this section without mentioning judgment. He says, so whether we are at home or away, this is the conclusion that it brought Paul to. As he contemplates the hope that he has, as he contemplates the things that he knows and the confidence of his salvation, he says, whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. That's his goal in life. His goal is not self-preservation. His goal in life is not to squeeze as many years as possible out of this life. And that's not to say that Paul didn't try to avoid death. He did. We see him sometimes fleeing cities as he's being persecuted. But at the end of the day, that wasn't his main aim. His central aim in life was to please God. Because he realized, having this knowledge of Jesus and knowing that now Jesus is at the right hand of God and we have this great salvation that's put before us, he realized there is something greater to fear than death itself. He says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. I want you to contemplate for a moment just how great of an obstacle to faith that fear is. Even as you just read through your Bibles and you reflect on the great stories, how great of an obstacle was specifically the fear of death to people that we read about in these Old Testament and New Testament stories. I think fear, and even fear of death, is something that destroyed the reign of King Saul. I think fear prevented all Israel from entering the promised land when they should have, as they looked at giants and what those giants were capable of doing to them and said, nope, we can't do it. Fear kept an entire army of God on the sidelines while Goliath taunted God and his people. Fear is what caused Peter to deny Jesus 3 times. Fear is why toward the end of Paul's life, almost nobody came to minister to him except Onesiphorus, Luke, and Timothy. These people failed the task before them because they feared one of two things more than they feared God. They feared people, or they feared circumstances. When they were called to push past that fear, to have courage, and to do the work that God had set before them. Paul didn't fear people. He didn't fear circumstances. At least that's not the thing that controlled his life. He feared something else. He feared standing before God. And whether or not, as God evaluates his heart, that God's evaluation of his heart would be that Paul's aim in life, the thing that controlled him, was trying to please God. Trying to please God in faith. Again, the Hebrew writer says it's impossible to please God without faith. We mustn't get so wrapped up in the reality of death that we forget something potentially more fearful awaits, and that is the judgment of God. And so Paul, he didn't worry about how many hated him or how many opposed him. There was no amount of persecution or threats or danger that would deter him from preaching the gospel, because his aim in life, whether through life or through death, whether at home or away, as he puts it, was to please him who has the power over death. I asked you to think about how fear of death was such an obstacle to people in the Old Testament and in the New, but for a moment I want you to think about the great heroes of faith that we read about through the Gospels and through the Bible. The greatest stories that we read about in the Bible almost always involve some element of the potential to die, to do what God has asked, to do what is pleasing to God. I think about Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. I think about Joshua and Caleb. They were the only two that were saying we can go into the land and take these guys. They weren't afraid to die. I think about David. He was one of the thousands that said, I can take this little shepherd boy. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace as they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel in the lion's den. The apostles and all that they encountered. Finally, most notably, Jesus himself. It's like you go on through the history of salvation and the history of the Bible, and the greatest feats of faith shows us people defiantly staring down death in order to do what pleases God. Their aim wasn't to please themselves, it was to please God. That's what Paul says. Whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. And so I just want to maybe end by simply asking this. Is that our aim? Is that our aim in life as we face death in the various forms that we might face it? Is that our aim as we face old age? Is that our aim as we face opposition? Is that our aim as we face sickness? Is our aim to please God? And I'll end on this hopeful note, because Paul, for some reason, is able to talk about judgment when just before he was confidently talking about salvation. If we have faith, you can have this confidence even going into judgment. God has prepared us for such a thing. That's what Paul says. We are prepared by God for these things. But the question is, have you taken advantage of it? In a moment, we're going to sing this invitation song, In the Desert of Sorrow and Sin. Are you in the desert of sorrow and sin? Maybe you're overcome by temptation, or maybe you are overcome by the sorrow that comes with the inevitability of death. In the gospel, through faith in Jesus Christ, you can be free from this slavish fear of death. And if you would like to do that, take advantage of that by being baptized in the name of Jesus, or if you have any other needs that you think we can help you with at this time, why don't you come forward as we sing the song of invitation.